all local companies gained some form of transparency, and it related to things like bank financing. It related to things like establishment of joint ventures.
Okay, Lawrence, welcome to Rising Giants. It's great to have you on. It's been a while since we've been able to do this, but excited to talk more about the real estate space in general and your journey coming to Cambodia and being here now for 3 years, really at this interesting vantage point, understanding what's going on in the real estate sector here. So I think before we dive into real estate and all that, it'd be great to just kind of understand your journey, leaving your home country and settling in Asia for the last decade or so. What was the original spark for leaving the Isle of Man? If people don't know where that is, that's in the UK, but it's a very unique island. So what was the spark for heading off?
I'm without doubt there were various drivers, and we don't necessarily need to go into the sort of the really meta sort of in-depth drivers as to why that occurred. But I think all we can. I guess we're here for a good conversation, and I think, like, if I'm honest, it's complicated, and I think part of it will come down to my father died when I was very young, and that put a lot of sort of context in terms of the shortness of our existence, as it were. So that was a big driver in terms of really sort of making the most of the short time that we have, to some extent. I guess also I must have a bit of an adventurous spirit, but outside of that, I studied politics in my undergraduate and did a lot of international relations modules, and that gave me a huge interest in sort of the rise of Asia, the Asian century, as it were, and all of the different sort of demographic drivers that we have seen unfolding after, over the past sort of 30 odd years or so. And that was definitely a big part of the driver, opportunism and somewhat, particularly for the first destination adventure.
And the first one was?
The first place that I lived and worked outside of the UK was Mongolia, which was an incredible place to sort of cut my teeth in terms of frontier real estate, as it were.
And what year was that you arrived in Mongolia?
I was there from 2014 to 2016, and again, I sort of. There's that saying, sort of, you can't make good steel without fire. I was there during a pretty challenging time in that market. A few years prior to me being there, my sort of employer was able to acquire residential property and pay off through the rental income in a sort of a year or two. The yields were that high.
Oh wow!
And again, that's sort of where my knowledge of these unusual dynamics comes from, because when I arrived, it had already started reaching a point of saturation in terms of supply. There's only 1.3 million people living in Ulaanbaatar, and they had a huge resource boom on the back of the growth and rise of China. They are probably one of the most resource-rich nations on the planet, with gold, uranium, copper. One of the biggest copper mines on the planet is in Mongolia. So quite intriguing.
And so you were there for 2-3 years. What were some of the highlights, and then what was the next destination after that?
Well, as I mentioned, sort of professionally, it was really interesting. I was in a sort of asset management role where I was helping to maximize the performance of this portfolio of property that the company had invested in. Outside of that, I was doing work around property valuation in terms of commercial property, and also doing some really cool advisory work with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank in terms of urban services, urban planning, which again, if any of you have met me in this context, I generally don't stop talking about zoning and planning and the need to enforce that in order to sort of help solve some of the challenges that we're facing currently.
And what would you say, like, Mongolia looks like today versus when you were there? Just curious on on how it's developed.
I don't want to it's been almost a decade since I was there, So I don't want to sort of overestimate my present knowledge, but it was a very intriguing context in terms of, just like Cambodia, we saw these leapfrogs there in terms of technological adoption. For us when we were there, it was sort of skipping the landline phone to going immediately to a smartphone. It was, already having a lot of these applications for food delivery very early on. They're very outward-looking people. The people there sort of often speak 3 languages at minimum. Intriguing, creative. There was a really strong arts scene there. So I used to be able to go to the sort of Bolshoi-trained ballet.
Wow.
I used to, on the flip side, go on these adventures into the steppe, for a few days and sort of just go into the middle of nowhere. And it was incredible staying with nomads, going horse riding, and it was pretty epic.
Yeah, I do hear it's becoming like an emerging, quite an adventurous tourist destination, but it seems like you need some time to explore because it's such a huge country.
Yeah, I mean, it's the least densely populated country in the world as well.
Yeah.
So just incredible to sort of, they say America's sort of this sort of land of the free.
Yeah.
It's literally the case there. You're in wilderness, and you end up in these sort of like cowboy towns where you're driving through the center, but then you see a literal modern day cowboy sort of riding down the center of this sort of village in the middle of nowhere. It's just incredible.
Yeah. Okay. So that was Mongolia for you. And then next on the docket was Myanmar, and maybe as I understand, 2016, 2017 was quite the exciting time to be in Myanmar. So maybe just explain a bit more about that experience and what it was like being there.
16, 17, 18. I loved working there. It was a very technically, let's say, challenging environment to work in, because more often than not, we were approaching property valuations that people just hadn't done before in that context.
Right.
I was involved with helping foreign companies gain some form of transparency, or local companies gain some form of transparency. And it related to things like bank financing. It related to things like establishment of joint ventures. And the work was extremely stimulating. It was things like valuing chains of islands to allow sort of Hong Kong private equity guys to come in and establish joint ventures, Japanese corporates to sort of set up joint ventures with local companies. So it was industrial work, it was hospitality work, it was service apartments, land valuations, pretty much you name it. I did one hospital valuation while I was out there. And again, it was just about creating transparency in what was a rapidly liberalizing and rapidly opening market. It was interesting because you had 60 million people. You have a land connection to India, China, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Laos. So it was sort of a real sort of regional hub, and still has so much potential.
Right.
The only problem is the instability created by so many different factors.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's such an interesting time to be there. I mean, when I was first coming to the region in 2020, it was really like Myanmar was the most exciting country to be sort of in that early stage of investment, or as you say, like private equity, venture capital, that kind of thing. So maybe just getting up to the present day, where you're now the managing director of CBRE Cambodia. What led you to that experience? I know you'd also spent some time in Vietnam. How did you land? Kind of in Cambodia.
Well, like with everything in life, I think it was a combination of hard work and good fortune to some extent. What percentage split goes into that, I'm not sure. But I had a stint with KPMG in Vietnam, and I did a feasibility study while I was there on a development site here in Phnom Penh, and that was in 2019, with my first taste of Cambodian real estate. an intriguing time to sort of have come onto the ground, because of course that was sort of a bit of an inflection point for the market as I see it, and I'm sure as many stakeholders see it.
Right.
And it sort of got my my emerging or frontier real estate market spidey sense sort of going, as it were, and definitely raised some questions around supply and demand dynamics. So that was my first taste. Went back to Vietnam and started building a business of my own. And unfortunately, the pandemic struck. But as I was sort of hustling away in Vietnam, doing a little bit of work in Myanmar, doing a little bit of work in Cambodia, but not being able to leave Vietnam because of the strict
very
pandemic
strict
rules. You know, as you do, you try to reach out to mentors, leaders, and people potentially with more experience than you have. And I jumped on the phone with our chairman. Well, no, I didn't. I sent him a cold message on LinkedIn, and he kindly responded saying,
chairman of
CBRE Cambodia.
Oh, CBRE Cambodia.
Yeah, very well seasoned. He's a veteran of Southeast Asian real estate.
Okay.
Reached out to him and sent him a cold email, as you do as an entrepreneur, and got a response back around a week later, and ended up having a 40-minute phone call with him. And I was genuinely looking for advice in terms of how I could navigate the storm and keep building.
Yeah, that's the most genuine way to build, you know, like real relationships that aren't about needing something too quickly, right?
Yeah. And he responded and kindly gave me 40 minutes of his time, and I thought that was it. You know, I didn't really think much more of it after that. But I had an email or a few LinkedIn ping messages coming through around a month later saying, "Oh, that there might be an opportunity over in Cambodia." Weighed things up.
And how big was the CBRE operation in Cambodia at the time?
I think it was around 65 person headcount at that stage.
Okay.
We currently have around 100 people, give or take. So we've gone through some growth.
And just so if the audience doesn't know, maybe just explain what CBRE is and what they focus on in Cambodia.
Yeah. We are an international real estate service provider. And I think the best way of describing it is that we are sort of involved in a real estate project at the sort of from the cradle to grave sort of cycle, as it were. So we'll do everything from valuing your property to giving advice in terms of market studies, research consulting, feasibility studies. A feasibility study is basically what is physically viable, what is legally permissible, and what is financially the most rewarding. And we give advice on that sort of stuff. Outside of that, we can sell land sites to developers. We do office leasing, residential sales and leasing, some industrial logistics related activity, leasing, land sales, some retail activity, property management, and pretty early stage project management, so like office fit outs and stuff like that. So quite an array of different services here on the ground.
Okay. And maybe to dive into next is, as you were alluding to earlier on, what it was like being here in 2019. Maybe you could give a brief kind of history of the real estate market in Cambodia. What have been kind of the main drivers of new supply, and kind of when the excitement got going, when the money started to move,
get pumping.
Yeah.
So again, that there may be listeners on the podcast that sort of call me out after sort of the conversation. So I'll do my best as a good consultant would to sort of give myself some caveats and say, I've been here for 3 years, so I am working off the data that I have at hand, and that data is in the form of like a supply chart that starts in around 2010, and I'll talk about primarily from a commercial real estate perspective, because we've got a really good amount of data on that space.
Yeah.
Of course, I could talk about berets in terms of landed property. I could talk about condominiums. But I would say particularly, let's say high-rise and commercial property, there's a bit of a trend. So as I see it, we saw the emergence of the start of the professional real estate cycle in 2010 or around 2010. And what that looked like was early stage office towers, like Canada Tower, for instance, then Vatanak Tower, for instance. These were quite early stage projects in the overall cycle. The supply increased progressively over the years from, as I said, 2010 was around 100,000 square meters to 2019 when we had around 500,000 square meters of net leasable area, so available space
in
the
Phnom
market,
Penh.
in Phnom Penh.
Okay. And does that? What about Sihanoukville? Do you also include that, or other tier 2 cities?
That's excluded from the statistics I'll talk about
Right.
at this moment.
Yeah.
So basically, we reached 2019, which was really when things started to sort of explode, as it were.
Okay. But already a 5x from 2010 through to 2019 on commercial real estate. Okay.
But still performing to a healthy extent. So average occupancy in the office market was around 90%.
Wow, yeah.
And rental rates were still pretty competitive, as in, like, from a landlord's perspective, pretty good returns on their investment. The big problem was that due to various factors, some of which I will mention now, some of which I won't, the supply continued to rise. And part of the challenge there was, to some extent, the experience that developers had on the ground, because it was still the first part of that real estate cycle in terms of particularly commercial property. And as I see it, some of the developers didn't necessarily see the challenges that were developing. Whereas, because I'm unusual, I'm like a time traveler in many respects, because I saw the challenges that unfolded in Mongolia, challenges that unfolded in Myanmar, which were quite similar.
Right. They had when would you say they had their professional real estate?
Well, basically, when I arrived in 2014, the top grade A office tower, Sakura Tower, was renting for around $56 per square meter.
Oh, wow.
And by the time I left, it was around $24 per square meter in the space of around 2.5 years.
Right. So you saw a 50% pullback in Mongolia basically from 2014 through 2016.
That was Myanmar.
Sorry, that's Myanmar. Sorry,
Yeah. And you know, as I mentioned, in 2019, I got on the ground and I was like, okay, some of this feels quite familiar in terms of what I observed. So basically, when we compare and contrast 2019 to today, at the end of last year, 2023, we ended up with 1 million square meters. So for contrast, 2019, 500,000 square meters. End of 2023, 1 million square meters of office supply. So it doubled again.
And that obviously a unique time to be doubling because of all the
pandemic
issues with the global economy. Yeah.
Well, the pandemic, increasing interest rates, just general inflation in terms of operating costs, labor, electricity to some extent. And because of a lot of these companies that are trying to navigate this challenging time, a lot of them aren't expanding necessarily, and some of them are actually contracting and handing space back. And we're not necessarily seeing a huge amount of multinationals sort of flying in and entering at the moment.
Right.
Basically, with this increase in supply, every landlord is competing for the same pool of occupiers, and that means that these landlords are reducing their rents.
Race to the bottom, basically.
They are providing rent-free periods. Sometimes they're providing fit-out conditions in some shape or form. Long story short, extremely competitive. And the big problem that we face is that we're expecting 200,000 square meters more of space to come online this year, and 200,000 more square meters to come on next year. So, so on the flip side, the potential is that what could we do with that space? what could we do with some of these really pretty decent office spaces in market, which will, by regional standards, be very, very competitive, be very, very competitively priced. So maybe it's going to be things like converting them to different uses. It could be healthcare, education, which for sure will be sort of two very good, organic, non-recessionary sort of growing industries. It could be things like retirement. The one thing I often think about in this context is actually, it's actually pretty easy to live in Phnom Penh.
Oh yeah, as a city, I think in Southeast Asia it's definitely one of the more livable ones.
Definitely,
right? Yeah.
So the potential there is that maybe if we improve some of the healthcare provision, it would mean that a lot of these rapidly aging countries in East Asia, like Korea,
right,
like Singapore, where cost of living is pretty high,
right,
could actually come and live a really, really decent sort of final stage of their lives at a great sort of price point in a place where people are really friendly, and that's something that needs to evolve, and I think will be a high potential space for the country. Yeah.
How do we? I mean, I think one thing to try and frame this, right? Because a lot of people probably be thinking 100,000 square meters and 1.4 million square meters. Like, how does that compare to other cities in the region? I think that's how you can really kind of see where Phnom Penh is.
Yeah. Well, so if we're looking at the total supply of Phnom Penh today, as I say, we're looking at around 1 million square meters.
Million square meters, yeah.
So we've got 3 million people in Phnom Penh.
Right.
Again, just for sort of people tuning in.
Right.
In contrast, Ho Chi Minh City grade A and grade B office combined is around 1.6 million. But they have 10 to 13 million people living in Ho Chi Minh City. Again, from a demand perspective, we have around 200 AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce members, whereas they have around 800 American Chamber of Commerce members. By contrast, Bangkok or Thailand's got 600.
It's a good, interesting indicator.
It is an indicator, right? And it's difficult to sort of compare apple to apple because it's never fair to do so. But again, you look at the way that people live and work as well. Is for sure we've got traditional small to medium-sized enterprise in Vietnam, but there's still a lot of people that live and work in offices. Whereas here we still have a lot of small to medium-sized enterprise that don't live or work in a sort of an office environment. And again, that will sort of further exacerbate and further create some challenges around that.
Yeah, that does. I mean, what we're basically saying is that in the next few years, the Phnom Penh commercial real estate will be at about 10 to 20% of, 80 to 90% of Ho Chi Minh. In terms of which is surprising given the fact that the population is 4 times larger. So there's definitely as you say, there's going to have to be a lot of focus on how you can attract sort of different kinds of occupancy to those spaces.
Creative solutions around alternative uses, and I think that the government stakeholders will actually be extremely supportive, and I have spoken with at least one of the relevant ministries, and the minister involved was very open and positive around conversion of use, for instance. The key then is just making sure that it's structurally sound, and making sure that the licenses are appropriately in place, and finding the right technical partner to come in and occupy and operate the business.
And just out of curiosity, what would you say on the commercial side? Who would you say the main investors have been in commercial real estate here, and how is that kind of mix shifting as time goes on?
So let's get more specific in terms of the office market. because commercial can mean a lot of things, particularly, it could mean like office, it could mean retail. And if it's retail, then it means different, community mall, shopping mall, et cetera, or mega mall, however you want to define it. In terms of office, right now it's around 50% Cambodian, and then the remainder are a range of different investors, some of which are joint ventures with Cambodian partners. But it's the usual suspects of Chinese, Cantonese, Singaporeans, Koreans, Japanese. It's the East Asians who have mature economies with low growth rates, and that's a big driver as to why they come to these contexts, because they're looking for growth, and they've got access to cheap finance at home. So it's worth taking that, let's say, risk for the potential upside reward of decent growth and decent returns.
But specifically on the, let's say, the Chinese investors, isn't as we understand, isn't that shifted quite a lot because of the controls that are in place in China now on real estate developers looking to expand outside of the country? Is that right, or have I got that?
Well, don't forget, a lot of this activity took place pre-pandemic,
right?
And the pandemic has been a bit of a driver of those shifts in the Chinese domestic landscape.
Right.
The Chinese economy is 30% real estate and construction in terms of its GDP.
Wow.
And it's 70% of its households are tied up in real estate. So
how does that compare to like a European economy? Or
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
But it's quite very high, right?
The point, the sort of the point of that statement was the fact that we've all heard of the Evergrande situation.
Yes. Yeah.
The reality is there's more than one Evergrande in that context.
Yeah.
And when 30%, a third effectively of the second biggest GDP on the planet is firefighting.
Yeah.
Not to mention the impact of the trade war, and not to mention the impact of deflation that they're experiencing in their country, because that, for the listeners' benefit, deflation is when a consumer puts off their purchasing decision into the future on the assumption that a price will be lower tomorrow than it is today. So they're going through this challenging situation where they're not having the consumption they need to stimulate.
Right.
They're having some global headwinds, which we're all sort of feeling the chill of. And that's a lot of that's on the back of the pandemic and the change of that, of what the government has done to change the structural drivers of the Chinese economy. And that is partly why they are the Great Firewall of China has come down in terms of deepened capital controls.
Right.
And from my understanding, that's not only impacting FDI in Asia, but it's also impacting things like infrastructure spending and development. And it's also impacting other markets. So I was reading just this morning about how these developers may have had projects in Australia or in Europe, and they're having to sort of dispose and exit of these sort of secondary markets for them in order to liquidate, get cash, and support their core in mainland China. Sorry to go on a bit of a tangent, but it's just deeper context that is important to understanding this economic environment.
Yeah, I think obviously that would be, I mean, that's definitely like the elephant in the room, right? With real estate in Cambodia. What would be interesting as well is like when we look at somewhere like Sihanoukville, right? Like, it's definitely become a bit of a signal of and an exemplification of how you can have a real estate but a bust almost, or just a serious amount of oversupply, and it's very apparent, right? Whereas in Phnom Penh, it's not super apparent. You kind of, you see things. It's healthier, right? So I'm just curious, like, what percent of the investment would you say into Sihanoukville was primarily Chinese real estate investors?
The statistics don't exist, but okay. I think again, using that elephant or dragon in the room analogy, it's probably primarily Chinese, directly or indirectly, because don't forget that some of the developments down there were built to suit projects. So basically you had a local landowner who had some agreement with an occupier, and he said, all right, I'll build you a building and you'll occupy it and you'll give me X thousand per month to come and occupy this.
Right.
So some people are left in the lurch in that respect.
Right.
So it's a combination, but I think a lot of it was primarily driven by Chinese investors.
And what I mean, I think Phnom Penh's obviously a situation that can be, there's many ways you can think about how to invigorate the demand in Phnom Penh.
Yeah.
In Sihanouk, though, I'm curious on what you think some of the appropriate solutions would be to kind of alleviate this oversupply.
Yeah. So there's so many different factors that come into this, but primary focus needs to be on creating the economic drivers. So building a good economic foundation and looking around the world for case studies and lessons from similar contexts.
Right.
Coastal Asian cities. So my pick would be Da Nang, that has similar scale, although they've got 1 million people actually, but and Sihanouk has around 80,000 currently. But beside that, let's say it has industrial activity, manufacturing, and it has some gaming activity, it has some hospitality activity, and actually has some sort of commercial activity taking place in terms of offices. So KPMG has an office in Da Nang,
right.
Savills has an office in Da Nang.
Yeah.
There are some multinationals present in that sort of secondary or tertiary city in Vietnam. That's happening. There is a sort of mixed use or multi-purpose special economic zone master plan, which is underway. So that's part of the equation. But I think the key is making sure that it's matching the scale of the context and matching the level of development of the context. Outside of that, it's getting the right, let's say, economic incentives in place to incentivize those types of industries. And then third will be things like making sure the appropriate education opportunities are in place to really drive manufacturing activity.
Right.
Another item that I would really focus on is things like how do you incentivize urbanization and quality urbanization. I'm going to use this platform to sort of mention one of my sort of dream scenarios where the government there's got to be at least 2 abandoned buildings, let's say, converts 2 of those into HDB style condominium, in the same way the Singaporean sort of 90% of homeowners are sort of these public housing development board of Singapore.
Yeah.
And they're extremely good houses in good locations. It would be a nice way of taking something positive from something that wasn't necessarily a positive situation. And I think that would be the sort of thing that would stem sustainable economic activity. Outside of all of that, education. There's generally nothing better to stimulate economic activity, particularly when it comes to entrepreneurial activity, than a decent university. So if it was me, I would be trying to attract an Australian university like RMIT, or a Chinese university, or a Singaporean university, or an American university to come in and set up shop at scale. It doesn't need to be a huge campus. It could be something small, baby steps, and just try and think about the mid to long term outcomes of that sort of activity.
That's an interesting way to look at it. What would you say are some of so when you mentioned about urbanization, what are we at currently in Cambodia?
We're 25% urbanized.
Okay.
So there's around 4 million people living in an urban setting in country, and then around 12 million people living in rural settings.
How does that compare to Vietnam, for example?
It's not so different. I think Vietnam is somewhere between 30 to 40% urbanized.
Okay.
And Thailand is somewhere between sort of 40% urbanized.
Right. Okay.
Again, that's one of the amazing things about these contexts, is that urbanization if you look at every other economic context, is almost inevitable. But the two things that are required in order to drive that in a more effective manner is agricultural productivity. So basically, as ag productivity goes up,
Right.
less people are needed in the fields.
Yeah.
They will traditionally then move to a factory, which again is the only meaningful way of creating thousands of jobs, which is what I loved about my work in Myanmar, because I was involved with sort of SEZs and a lot of industrial early stage establishment. And then from there, people buy affordable housing, and it's like a wonderful sort of stepping stone. They then also send their children to school because they've got some cash and they've got a shift. If you're in the field, then you can get obliterated if you have a bad season, if you're a sort of a small holding farmer. And then even worse if you are not sort of financially literate and make some bad life choices. So I think agricultural productivity, industrialization, and maybe even just agro-industry in terms of processing that agricultural stuff, some pretty important areas to be focusing on.
Yeah, no, because you're saying if we go from 25 to 40, that's an extra 15%, which is nearly 2 million people, or just about 2 million people. And you'd presume some of them would maybe choose some of these tier 2, or like not Phnom Penh as a city.
Potentially. And generally speaking, countries' economies are much better off when they're not monopole economic states. Vietnam benefits from having Hanoi, Da Nang, and Haiphong and Ho Chi Minh City. It spreads things out, and it means that when it comes to urban development, it's a much more manageable experience. Whereas somewhere like Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, they experienced rapid and pretty painful urbanization, where people were forced from the steppe for various reasons, whether it's seeking economic opportunity or due to climatic reasons, having their livestock wiped out, and then ending up in this urban context, pretty much lost, and ending up in what is effectively a shanty town, which is the Gear district. And the problem there is you end up with poor urban infrastructure, like waste management, roads, access to urban services, etc., etc. So interesting stuff, at least for me. Anyway.
No, I remember someone telling me, well, the former company I used to work for called OBG, they had an operation in Myanmar, and one of the issues they said, because it's in a valley, Ulaanbaatar, there's a lot of coal that's being burned, and they have really bad pollution.
It's in the wintertime, it's like a post-apocalyptic landscape.
Wow.
I had to wear a face mask. I had to have an air purifier at home. It gets like minus 30, minus 40 in the wintertime.
Wow.
So these people living in Shanty Town, Gear District, are basically burning anything they can find in order to survive, basically. So it's literally like Mad Max style, wild situation, but stunning, beautiful, strong people.
Maybe just going into that in more detail. Like, so you've worked in 4 countries. What would you say? What makes like Cambodia unique, or even some of the other countries as well, from a work perspective, culture, building teams, like. What has been different about some of these countries?
I mean, each country represents a different chapter.
Yeah.
Mongolia, I was straight out of finishing my master's, and I wanted to, as I mentioned, I was brutally aware of the shortness of life. So I wanted, I wanted to do something different, and I applied for lots of jobs in lots of places. And then someone said, "Here's a plane ticket, here's an apartment, come to Mongolia." So my stepdad gave me some great advice and said, "Lawrence, the only thing you have to lose is the price of a plane ticket home. Go for it."
Right.
That's
a good way to put it.
I did it. And that was sort of a big personal growth experience. Myanmar was great from a technical development standpoint. It was my first real time in Southeast Asia, which most people think is insane because I had 2 days in Singapore when I was around 17, and that was my taste of Asia. Before that, by the way, before moving to Mongolia, I'd only had 2 days in Singapore.
Yeah, which is very different too.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Myanmar taught me about Southeast Asia, I think, and taught me about sort of Southeast Asian conglomerates and the way they operate and how rapid development, or what it looks like, basically.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I learned some really amazing sort of fundamental skills out there. Vietnam is where I met my wife. So again, there's a personal sort of point in that chapter.
Yeah.
But again, sort of just seeing the strength of political stability, with pretty strong mid to long term thinking in terms of infrastructure investment, educational investment, and culture. They work pretty damn hard, I would say. Yeah. Cambodia, again, just different, and again, so many lessons learned. I would say leadership, soft skills such as I don't know whether you define hard skills or soft skills in terms of HR, marketing, public speaking. I really, really enjoyed that part of my role in terms of having to stand in front of, senior government officials and sort of present to them, or the country's sort of OCNIAs, et cetera, that's been pretty fascinating. And I see a huge amount of potential in this context, particularly around agriculture. My personal vision for Cambodia is around becoming a breadbasket for Asia or Southeast Asia. We have...
Well, the Tonle Sap is, the number one.
But out of all of our exports, the highest agri-related export is rice, which is just 1% of exports. There's more to be had there, I would say,
especially on the agro processing, right? Like
exactly,
getting it from raw to the next.
Exactly. So a vision I have for Cambodia is building special relationships around food scarcity with certain countries. It could be China, it could be Australia, it could be Singapore. Most developed nations on this planet have food security concerns.
Right.
Get some of these individuals involved, government to government, corporate to corporate level.
Yeah.
And have them cooperate, and also have skill transfer in that process to maximize the productivity of agricultural activity here, and then plow that into processing, value add, and then next step on that ladder, as I mentioned, is stuff like manufacturing. And I think the key is just finding that niche, which needs some fine tuning around things like the cost of electricity, education, logistics costs,
and maybe just also just touching on the what it's been like building your team here. You said you went from 65 people to over 100. What have been some of the things that you think you've got right? And I would also be interested to hear on the other side, some of the common pitfalls that people have, coming in and managing teams where they're coming from abroad, and in their first year or so, second year, they kind of learn how it works, right? So I'd just be curious what you've got right, and then what would be some advice to people coming in to
Good
to
questions.
adapt?
I think patience is a really critical one. Patience is key. I think understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your team is a really important one. So by that I mean knowing where to push and where to sort of guide if that makes sense. I think that's pretty important stuff. I think there's a lot of value in having diverse teams, bringing on board different strengths and different capacities. You know, we're in Cambodia, so of course you need Cambodian people that speak Cambodian, that read the Cambodian language. And then on the flip side, having people from different cultures that can provide maybe some contextual perspectives. So like, you know, what's happening in the Philippines in terms of development activity, or Thailand in terms of development activity, or Vietnam or Myanmar. Having that sort of playbook of different contexts helps out a lot because there's a lot out there. And I mean, if there's anything that any of your listeners take away from this this conversation, is that the most important thing you can be doing right now is traveling and exploring what's going on in other contexts, and then bringing those ideas back and trying to implement them. Understanding that, like all businesses, you know, to some extent throwing paint at the wall and seeing, you know, what works and what doesn't, and doubling down on the stuff that sticks.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And what would be some of the, I mean, one question we like to ask people sometimes, like, what are some of the things that you wish you had told, like day one when you're writing Cambodia, that you know now today?
Good question. The thing is, I wasn't fresh off the boat.
Yeah,
if you know what I mean.
Right.
So it wasn't like this was my first time living and working in Asia, or an emerging Asian context, or you know, the culture of Myanmar and Cambodia are very, very similar.
Yeah.
They're both Buddhist. They're both in the sort of the the Indo-cultural sphere of influence to some extent.
Yeah.
As is Thailand, as is Laos. And I think I just about was able to navigate without standing on too many toes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's being British. I don't know. We're quite good at sort of going around about a specific topic and getting a message across in an extremely polite way, which seems to allow us to be quite adaptive when it comes to navigating different cultures and contexts.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. We are known as like to be diplomatic, and like communication to say one thing and mean another, or you know, to be quite what is the word? So I mean, I guess some people say it's sarcasm, but it's also just saying things.
I'm not sure whether because sarcasm is a negative connotation.
Yes,
to it, I would say so. It's probably the wrong word to use here, but I think diplomacy is just a better word, because you know we.
But sometimes people will not know if a British person is using sarcasm. You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah, happens all of the time.
It'll be so sort of. It'll be
subtle.
It'll be very subtle.
Yeah. But again, I think there are negative connotations to the word specific sarcasm.
Right, there is,
because you don't want to be sarky. You know, no one wants to be referred to as the sarcastic guy.
Yeah.
But I think the guy with a subtle sense of humor may be a better way of describing it. I don't know.
And always, as they say, I mean, I think this can go too far, but self-deprecation is definitely a key trait of the UK.
British humor.
Yeah.
we make fun of it. You know someone's a good friend of yours if he says something terrible to you.
Yes. Right. Tall poppy. They say tall poppy syndrome, right?
Yeah.
Just diving into like the more interpersonal side of things as we kind of come towards the end of the podcast. Are there any habits that you install in yourself on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis, that kind of keep you motivated and keep you on your path that you're on?
Not to sound too cliche, but exercise is definitely an important factor, just in terms of just general physical and mental well-being. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm running triathlons or anything like that.
Ironmans.
but literally just getting up early in the morning, getting some natural sunlight and walking outside in the city is something that I really have enjoyed adopting. Outside of that, I've started playing basketball with a group of Cambodian and Chinese guys, which I really enjoy as well, because there's a sort of a social component to it, just as much as really, really intense exercise. So that's something which is relatively new, but it's something that I really enjoy doing because, as I say, it's a social activity while also being pretty physically intense.
Mm-hmm. And would you say you've had any? Are there any like key kind of mentors that you've had, or maybe philosophies or people that you follow that have kind of stuck with you through time?
Yeah, I mean, my stepdad, as I mentioned earlier on, has been an absolute champion. He is an accountant and therefore sees the world in very objective ways. So I've leaned on him a great deal in terms of advice. I regularly try and reach out and meet people that are at different stages in their career. And I'm never shy to ask for advice or sort of seek people's opinions. Finally, again, it's very en vogue. So, as you can see, I like to sort of at least try to be a little bit alternative in the way I think, but I'm not sure whether I am in this context. But Stoic philosophy is pretty interesting in terms of meditations from Marcus Aurelius. It almost feels cliche to talk about it on a podcast these days. But the terminology that they use, memento mori, remember you will die, is something that sort of has always struck home with me in many ways. But then, Zen philosophy. I love this guy called Alan Watts.
Oh yes,
who I've been listening to since I was a teenager. His lectures are pretty special and pretty intriguing, and definitely caused me to sort of challenge the way that I see the world and myself. So some Zen Buddhist philosophy, some sort of ancient Stoic philosophy, and then one last sort of philosophy, sort of source in terms of the way of thinking of how to live. Is this organization called the School of Life? There's this
I've heard of them.
British
on YouTube, right?
Swiss philosopher called Alain de Botton, who I discovered really fortunately when I was at university, and I sort of just I absorbed. I read a lot of his books, and yes, he does have this great YouTube channel as well, and
that's it. Okay, yeah,
I highly recommend it to your audience, just in terms of thinking about relationships, family, loved ones, wives, wife, I should say, and the way that we live, work. So that has also been a pretty big influence.
I really like that channel. It distills philosophers like into like
the School of Life.
Yeah, like 5-minute segments with nice videos for the more like visual learners. Okay, and our traditional closing question that we'd like to ask everyone is, what is the most important piece of advice that you've ever been given?
There's no one specific piece of advice, I would say. Cumulative bits of advice. I mean, so one of my favorite sayings of all time is at least it used to be on the £2 British coin, standing on the shoulders of giants, which is a Sir Isaac Newton quote. And what he was referring to is that, himself, despite being a giant of science, was standing on the shoulders of giants. As in, he wasn't the primary one to sort of take credit for his achievements. And I take a similar sort of stance to life in general. And I guess it brings a good amount of humility to how you approach things. So I think that idea of we are a collective and we are sort of helping one another is important to consider, that 5 brains are better than one, so it's way better to be working with people or even just like reading and exploring history and philosophy and trying to learn from other people's mistakes.
Great. Well, on that note, we really want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on Rising Giants today. Learned a lot about the real estate sector, about your journey and your philosophies that guide you through life. So thanks very much, and all the best to the future.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Max.